welcome, Nicky. I'm delighted that you're here.
It's good to be back.
Nicky's going to be talking about the Havana Syndrome podcast that is out.
It is, yeah.
And
this time not on Audible, wherever you get your podcasts.
wherever you get your podcasts, right.
And I don't have to tell anyone on the 30-day free trial now, which is a relief.
Right, so Nicky was here last year to talk about QAnon, and today he's here to talk about the Havana Syndrome. So I think we're in the same kind of ballpark in terms of conspiracy theories, but a very different kind of, and actually is this...
We'll get to that, yeah.
This is more disinformation, or is it...
There's a lot of that going on.
Or lack of information.
We'll get ahead of ourselves. This is...
Yeah. In any case, let me just tell you a tiny bit about Nicky first before you start. And so, Nicky is a writer and journalist based between London and New York. He's a graduate of the student newspaper and technically the English literature department at the University of York. He moved to Hicksville, Ohio, love that name, in 2012 to cover U.S. politics for the New Statesman magazine, before downgrading to New York to study journalism and neuroscience at Columbia. Then he joined The Guardian as a U.S. correspondent, reporting over the years from Silicon Valley, Capitol Hill, and pretty much everywhere in between, before leaving to launch New Statesman America, a new U.S. sister site of the venerable UK political magazine. Over the years, he became terminally online and cultivated a masochistic niche reporting on the weird stuff that happens when technology, internet subculture, and politics meet. All that time delving into conspiracy theories, online radicalization, information ecosystems, and the rise of the digital far right. All of this turned his brain basically to mush.
Pretty much, yeah.
He said it himself. I didn't say it about him. But it also led him to his first foray into podcasting with Finding Q, an award-winning Audible series investigating the shadowy figures behind the movement known as QAnon. And then after Q, he moved on to the Havana Syndrome, which I guess is less conspiracy theory and more, what do you make of?
Yeah, well, okay, as a baseline, are you guys familiar with Havana Syndrome as a term, or should I do a quick kind of... So in 2016, American diplomats in Havana, in the newly opened embassy in Havana, started to get mysteriously ill. They got cognitive difficulties, headaches, nosebleeds, all kinds of sort of the symptoms of a concussion, but without any history of head trauma. In fact, one of the early sufferers dubbed it the immaculate concussion, because there was no... It's sort of what you'd get from playing in the NFL, but they were just getting it in the embassy. And they'd all heard this weird sound that was sort of this buzzing, electronic sounding noise. And the first 5 cases were all in the CIA station, we later found out, and then it spread to the diplomatic section, and then it went public in early 2017, and then things went completely ballistic. So there were maybe 30 cases when it went public, and it kept growing. There's now maybe 5,000 or 6,000 worldwide. They're all mostly American diplomats, some Canadians, some British, very few British. Nobody seems bothered enough about British Foreign Service to point any weapons at us. But this was the Trump administration era, right? The first thing that got said about it when it was announced was by Rex Tillerson at the State Department, who said that a sonic energy weapon had been deployed at American diplomats by the Cubans. The CIA came out and said that it was an attack, but not with a sonic energy weapon. The FBI would later come out and say that both the CIA and the State Department were full of shit. Everyone's come out with different theories. The theory changed over and over again. And I got brought in, having done QAnon, to report on this as if it's to debunk this conspiracy theory, because people were like, this can't be real. And unfortunately, after about 10 months of research, I can't say that I don't think there's something real at the core of it, which is a really, really unfortunate position to be in as a conspiracy theory misinformation reporter, right? Like that's not ideal. The problem is that these type of weapons we discovered do exist. We spoke to the CEO of a defense company that was asked to develop one, and then in the conversation we had with him, he was like, and then he said, we developed this whole thing for the Marine Corps, of all people, who were the ones who commissioned this particular one, with the specifications to do exactly what we're describing, kind of long-range, directed energy to cause neurological damage. And he said, then the Marine Corps took it to another defense company, and he goes, Raytheon. And we were like, okay, so these things do exist. We found the training manuals. The problem is, then there was the wide spread of it. So once it went from that kind of 30 cases to 5,000 or 6,000, then we started looking at the idea that some of it might be psychogenic, which means the power of suggestion, the power of suggestibility. The problem is, and as one of the sufferers, one of the sources told us, the power of suggestion is unbelievably strong. It can cause all of the cognitive issues. It can't make you bleed out of your eyes. There were some symptoms that some of the core people were getting, and some of those symptoms were only known to people who had classified clearance for quite a long time during this. Some of the symptoms could not be explained entirely by psychogenic spread. So we're sat there like, fuck. Look, sorry, am I swearing too?
It's quite all right.
Well,
I think we've heard the word.
Yeah. Well, like, I got brought in to debunk this conspiracy theory, and now we think it's, at least at the core of it, real. But then it got taken up by this whole information ecosystem where all of the US agencies want you to think a different thing. The CIA wish everyone just wouldn't talk about it at all. The State Department are angry because their people are getting sick. The FBI just want to annoy the CIA. The FBI and the CIA, by the way, hate each other. They absolutely loathe each other. Everything that we found out about the CIA was from stuff the FBI told us, and vice versa. They just colossal kind of no love lost there. So, yeah, I think there is an energy weapon of some kind. We know Lockheed Martin makes one, and we know Raytheon makes one. We know there's a Chinese equivalent. We know there's a Russian equivalent. We know Australia has bought the Lockheed Martin one. And then it ends up in this information ecosystem whereby nobody knows which of the cases are real and which ones are psychogenic. And that obviously is a massive help to whoever's deploying it. We spoke to one diplomat who said, you know, some of it's clearly psychogenic. We think some of it is actually the deployment of some kind of device. Russia is the top suspect, and if it is Russia, what this diplomat said was that it's been a tearing success. The CIA and the State Department cannot fill overseas postings now, especially for people with families. People are just refusing because they're like, we might have this pointed at us and we don't know what it is. And nobody seems to be doing anything about it. And the other kind of accidental side effect of all of this is that the Trump administration rolled back on Obama's opening up of Cuba. So the Cuban economy, which had opened up, there were suddenly hundreds of thousands of tourists coming from the US. Everyone in Cuba had, poured their life savings into opening a restaurant, opening an Airbnb. Suddenly this all got closed off again, and the Cuban economy went into absolute freefall, like disaster level freefall. So whatever kind of mysterious energy war is going on between Russia and the US, the side effect has been the complete destruction of Cuba as an economy. And that's really sad. And we went there and, we were paying for things with bricks of cash. I mean, the amount of Cuban currency we bought at the beginning of our 10-day trip was completely different to the amount that we could buy at the end of it. And it's only got worse from there. And yeah, if it's designed to cause fear, it's been a huge success at that. And nor is it out of the ordinary, it turns out, for the kind of thing that Russian and American spies are doing to each other. So we looked at this thing called the Moscow signal, which was where American diplomats in Moscow in the 80s, the Russians, and they knew all about this at the time, the Russians were bathing the American embassy in microwave radiation in order to turn on passive listening devices. So these would be bugs that couldn't be detected because the energy for them was coming from outside. And this feels like it should be a bigger news story than it is. The rates of cancers for people who served in the US embassies in Moscow in the 80s are sky high, I mean arrestingly high. So there is a history of these kind of weird experimental devices being deployed and then having awful unintended consequences. So yeah, our second to last episode, the Directorate of National Intelligence tried to screw us by releasing a study which they said at the time was, this is the absolute final answer, this is not happening. And the Washington Post ran with that and said, final answer is given, Havana Syndrome isn't a thing. And we saw this study and we said, this sort of doesn't feel right. And we had sources saying that one of the agencies that had not, so the DNI, which is the agency in the White House that was put in after 9/11, or after the 9/11 Commission report, technically is supposed to make all of the agencies work together. In reality, it just adds another layer of bureaucracies because the agencies are never going to work properly together. They essentially tried to screw us and ended up screwing the Washington Post because we said, no, we stand by this reporting, and then they walked it back 2 weeks later, leaving the Post completely high and dry. So we were like, bad luck, guys. But yeah, unlike with QAnon, where we sort of found the dude behind it, we came out of this project with more questions than we went into it with, and also with the terror of not only is there a whole kind of level of secret crap going on, half of the people in these agencies don't have a clue what's going on. So there's a huge amount of misinformation going on around it. Like in the media, people don't understand what it is. But half the FBI doesn't know what it is. Half the CIA doesn't know what it is. That's the realization that these ginormous agencies are kind of just as hapless as the rest of us was really terrifying, I would say. That was my takeaway is that the American and global spy agencies haven't got a clue what they're doing. So yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a couple questions then. So one is it still going on? Because we don't hear about it in the media anymore.
There's still cases being reported. I don't think, it's impossible to know now that it's a big thing in the public media, whether it's, any case could be psychogenic or could be real. The only way to really try and figure it out is to say, in whose interest is it? Like, there were reported cases on White House grounds. I find that very, very difficult to believe that someone near the world's most defended building could point anything at it. That kind of beggars belief. If you're serving at a US embassy in Eastern Europe, I think it's very plausible. There is no way of telling a psychogenic case from a real case. And there's still no real diagnostic criteria to identify a real case.
So technologically, there's no way you can actually, no one knows when it's happening. There's no instrument there that can gauge that it's happening.
So some brain scan studies identified damage, but they didn't have brain images on file for the people beforehand. And so they say, there's white matter changes, but if you don't have a before picture, you can't say for sure that there's been changes. So it's really difficult to tell. But yes, I think it's...
So and is this anyone in these embassies? Because it's generally embassies, I assume.
Generally embassies...
And is it anyone and everyone in the embassy, or does it appear to be more high-level people?
It's targeted enough that at the beginning they were able to hit just the CIA station within the embassy. I don't think if there is a concerted effort still at an American embassy that, and let's just go ahead and say Russia, because there doesn't really seem to be anyone else whose MO this is. I don't think they care all that much who gets hit tangentially. But it is quite, we actually built one. We built a directed microwave energy device.
Your team?
Yeah, out of cannibalized. We've drafted in my housemate, who's a particle physicist, and he cannibalized 5 kitchen microwaves in a big dish. And we detected the rays, at a distance. If we can do it, I mean, a defense company can obviously do considerably more than that. And now that the idea is out there and it's public, kind of anyone can do it. I mean, there's this whole, as there always is in spycraft and CIA and MI6 and stuff, there is a secret conflict going on that no one's got any idea of, really. And this has just sort of added a new weapon to the arsenal.
But, yeah, so one doesn't know, you can't capture it at the moment.
No.
Because there's no equipment necessarily there to, right. And are we doing it to others? You said that we have.
We certainly have it. We wouldn't know if Russian diplomats started having weird headaches. We just don't know. We certainly can. We know that Britain's bought versions of the device. We know Australia has. Germany, we know China has their own version. It's kind of everywhere now. So people are deploying it, but Russia wouldn't report if they were having weird headaches.
Okay, I'll open it up for questions, and then I'll come back to you with another series.
Yeah.
Can you just explain to the illiterate, or disillusioned, exactly what psychogenic means?
So psychogenic is the power of the brain itself under suggestion to cause physical symptoms. So you got this with, it goes back as far as there was this famous thing called the German dancing mania, where people would start dancing and kept dancing until they died. But it was a contagion that spread psychologically.
Where's the suggestion coming from?
Outside. You hear about it and you say, and subconsciously your brain can cause you to have all of these symptoms. It's terrifying how powerful the suggestibility can be. And it is well within that capability to cause headaches, dizziness, nausea. It's and you get it a lot. There was a lot of debate about psychogenesis with a lot of what's been going on with long COVID. So people have been reporting symptoms that could be caused by COVID, but also could be that people have read a lot about the symptoms of long COVID and not just thought they had the symptoms, but actually developed symptoms because of that suggestion.
Yeah, for example, do not read medical manuals.
Oh God, yeah. I
Because
mean,
every time I've read, at some point long ago, I would start reading, oh, I have something that doesn't feel right, let me go see. And each time I had all of the symptoms,
Mhm.
I just knew it. And then it was doing worse. Anyway, I stopped reading the medical manuals and it all went away.
Stop looking at Google.
Yeah.
well, I mean, WebMD, it's been terrible for this because it's possible to go on the internet and diagnose yourself with anything.
And everything.
Mm.
Yeah. So I'm actually interested in the kind of disinformation side. You know, why does the CIA deny it? What does the FBI say? And what does the State Department say? How do they manage this kind of information?
So the DNI report was an interesting example of this. So what they came out with the report, the headline of which was, and we're talking January of this year, the headline of which was, this is not a thing. And you read into the report, and what the DNI have done is asked a yes, no, or maybe question of all of the US agencies. Like a poll. But they didn't say which agency is which. They were saying of the 9 agencies we asked, 7 responded, of which 5 said weak no, and 2 said we don't know. And they brought that out with the headline of this is absolutely not happening. And we're reading that like,
What? Yeah.
what? That doesn't, if that was how, there's poison in the school food, you would not be, that's not a high confidence interval. And then we were hearing from our sources that one of the agencies that declined to answer the question at all was the DOD. Like the Pentagon was like, so we were like, well, that does rather undermine. And so it's the information ecosystem within the US government where there's 2 things going on. There's one, what the agencies want everyone to think, which is largely that they're capable and that their individual agency is more capable than the other ones. The second is what they want the other agencies to know about what they're doing. So there's inter-US agency misinformation where someone like the DNI will want it to seem like nothing is happening because someone like the CIA or the DOD will have been like, can you stop everyone talking about this? Which is horrifying. It's the QAnon was a misinformation kind of organic creature. This is a concerted effort to use misinformation to muddy the waters about dodgily anti-Geneva Convention stuff that everyone seems to be doing, which is so much worse in a lot of ways.
So, why did the National Intelligence Agency decide to release the report? I mean, this was about concerns about public responses, public panic.
Yeah.
Public panic and also the risk of more congressional oversight. That's the other part of the disinformation, is that the agencies want as little accountability as possible. So they want everyone to think, oh, it's not a thing. And we were hearing from a lot of the diplomats and a lot of the spies who'd been directly affected, who were extremely angry about this, because it's sweeping it under the rug, basically. It's saying, nothing to see here. We're not doing it, no one's doing it, let's stop talking about it. And there are the actual victims who are permanently disabled. I mean, if you get a direct hit from whatever this is, it's lifelong disability.
It doesn't go away.
No.
And what are the symptoms? Is it constant headaches or?
Constant headaches, constant nausea, memory problems, cognitive problems, vision problems, hearing problems.
Are they still working, or do they have to go on disability?
A lot of them are on disability now.
There have been no incidences of drug? No one's overcome it?
Because, so yes, some people have had the symptoms temporarily and they've gone away. Whether that means that was a kind of glancing hit, like maybe they walked through some kind of beam. And again, we don't really know that much about what the weapons as deployed look like. The latest one that we've seen in development was the early 2000s. So we're making an inference that whatever's out there is more capable than that. Or maybe those are the people who have the psychogenic suggestion version of it. But there's no way of telling between the two. It's a mess, honestly. Like it's as a reporter, it's the nightmare story because we came away from 10 months reporting this, and we're like, we know less about this now than when we started, except we know enough to be both afraid of the malice of all of these departments and the incompetence of all of these departments. Because they've been developing these since the 90s. I mean, since earlier than that. Microwave energy has been deployed as part of surveillance, certainly since the 70s. You'd have thought someone would be working on countermeasures. But if they had successful countermeasures, we wouldn't know about it. Probably quite rightly so. But also fewer people would be getting injured. But yeah. There's not a huge amount of things we know for sure in this world, which is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, Alex.
I wanted to know why you think you said it was the Washington Post that ran with the DNI report. Why would they do that, especially if there were such strikingly obvious glaring holes in the validity of the report? What interest would the Post have to so blatantly run with that?
That was a question we asked ourselves at the time. We were baffled by when the Post came out so strongly. And so we asked a couple of our friends there, and what we were hearing was that they were being heavily briefed on background by their sources within the DNI. So someone at the DNI was telling the Post's senior reporters, yeah, this is not a thing, you can trust us, you can roll with it. The reporters who wrote that story up, it was Shane Harris and it was John Hudson, I can't remember the name of the other reporter. You know, these are not cub reporters, they know their stuff, which is what gave us pause. We were like, you know, if Shane Harris is going with this story, then we have to consider it. It seems like they just got screwed over. And I don't know why the DNI decided it was worth what presumably was burning a relationship at the Washington Post, because Shane is not going to trust them again when they say, you know, we guarantee you this is a thing. But they got screwed. And I don't know why it would be in the DNI's interest to do that.
Was there any relationship between your podcasts, do you think, and the DNI, or had the DNI just done this pretty flawed study and decided they wanted to put it out there?
I don't want to say for sure that the timing was aimed to coincide with just before our final episode. But the timing was quite suspicious. I think they probably moved something forward that was already in the works, which might have been why it came out so half-assed. I mean, it would be very flattering if our podcast was such that the Directorate of National Intelligence decides to try and screw us. So, I mean, it must have been in the works already. But we weren't the only report coming out about this at the same time, so maybe they thought the press attention had got to a level that they needed to address. But it completely backfired, because when they walked it back, everyone was like,
So this was, I mean, I remember reading at the time, so
Yeah.
it was news.
Mm.
It became news.
and then it was news again when they walked it back, because, I mean, especially for the Washington Post, who were like, well, screw you guys.
You said that this started in like 2016-ish, but they had been doing like research with microwaves since the 90s. Were there, in like your research, were there any like one-off reports of these things happening to, like these symptoms happening to like diplomats, whether in the US and Cuba, or, you know, I know you said that Russia doesn't really report that, or was it really just like something that kind of outbroke out of nowhere?
So there were things like the Moscow signal, which was also a directed microwave energy system. There were loads of reports of side effects coming from things like that, which were surveillance devices. We still don't know fully that this wasn't a surveillance device of some kind. It's possible it could just be an evolution of a more targeted version of that. It's really hard to say when the first, because the symptoms are so diverse and kind of nebulous, it's difficult to say, oh, this was one, but it happened before. But certainly anecdotally, we had people come forward and say, yeah, this happened to me in 2011, this happened to me in 2005. But, you know, it's headaches and nosebleeds. It could be, it's so hard to know for sure until there started to be a pattern.
Still dealing with the symptoms, because you said that the majority are like fully disabled. Has it been easier since this has been released, of people coming forward?
Certainly, I think people appreciate that attention is finally being paid to it and that people are taking them seriously, because for a long time they felt very dismissed. They had to fight really hard to get medical care and medical leave. They had to really fight to persuade the world that what was happening to them, because this psychogenic theory was so powerful, they were dismissed very heavily at the beginning. I'll give you an example. One of the sources we were speaking to was this guy in Baltimore who had been in, he's sort of dark ops, like nebulously spy contractor stuff. And he developed the symptoms in a hotel in Hanoi and spoke to his CIA handler about it and said it was in this hotel room, or rather the CIA handler was talking to him about it and was saying, were you staying in this hotel? Because we had someone who also was staying in the hotel. And this guy who lives in Baltimore was like, was it room 306? And the CIA guy was like, how did you know that? And it had been the same room. And that leads to two conclusions. One is that whoever was doing that, deploying the device, can have set up in the room next to where they know the CIA puts its black ops people. And two, why the hell are they using the same hotel room every time? Like, who is, like, switch it up a little bit, guys. Like, this comes back to the competence thing. There were moments where me and my producer Max were like, we could run an agency better than these guys. And partly that's, the buck ultimately stops with political appointees whose interests are completely orthogonal to the actual safety of personnel.
But is it political appointees or is it deeper in the organization? I mean, is this about a mindset?
It's both, I think. You get a lot of lifers whose priority is not the safety of the US, but the primacy of the CIA over the FBI. And this was, the 9/11 report is good reading on this because it completely excoriates this culture. And that's what the DNI was supposed to change, and it absolutely didn't change anything. And then you have politicians who want things to be solved within a 2-year congressional election cycle. Neither of those things leads to good leadership, and the two of them at the same time can be disastrous.
So, really fascinating conversation, also quite puzzling, this phenomenon. I'm thinking on two axes with regard to the discussion. One on the disinformation front, sort of understanding, the challenges to the presumption of sort of state actors being, sort of equally apprised of the situation, or as I think about it, information asymmetry, or rather information symmetry. And I'm really interested to sort of hear more about how you sort of think this sort of scales to other states, this sort of like contested sort of relationship between actors that are all a part of the state, ostensibly, but all are competing for different interests and have different objectives. And also extending on that, and I think you sort of touched on this really briefly, this idea of going back to that sort of asymmetry of information, the DNI sort of going and doing this yes, no, maybe sort of question, but also knowing that people probably reserve different understandings of the situation. Part of me is interested in sort of understanding how, state actors even deploy, asymmetric information tactics to sort of manage risks to legitimacy and even anxiety about, their performance in general. And we also know within the literature that, states do take that into account, or state actors do take that into account in their own sort of risk calculus. And really how the intelligence community and the defense community is actually in sort of a 2-level game with the state in sort of balancing interest and sort of, forestalling, intense state scrutiny. So just really interested and curious to hear your thoughts on that and what you sort of think.
I would say game is absolutely the word. Kind of culturally, from going back as far as the Second World War and certainly during the Cold War, there has been this feeling, especially in the intelligence agencies rather than defense. So for the CIA, for MI6, they're playing. They see themselves as part of some kind of battle of wits in which there's both kind of no holds barred, but also a certain level of mutual respect between the opposing agents of the opposing agencies. And so they love to both downplay the effectiveness of their opponents and play up their own effectiveness. They want to look like they're doing successful spying. So there's information asymmetry between each of these agencies within this secret game, and then there's a PR aspect where they want the world to see them as effective. And then you've got the other players around, you've got the kind of rest of the Five Eyes who are sort of mucking about. China is a big part of this increasingly. So of the 4 spikes that we think a device was deployed, there was Havana, Hanoi, Guangzhou, and Vienna. Now Vienna was during the Iran deal negotiation, so you can totally see what the impetus would be there.
But by whom?
We assume Russia did not want the Iran deal to go through.
Didn't want the JCPOA.
Is that not the...
The Iran deal.
Yeah.
Iran nuclear deal.
I mean, that was our kind of guess, but I mean, this is more...
the understanding is that they wanted it very much. Being-
Could
You
the
know,
Americans
really-
have done it to themselves?
I mean, again, after reporting all of this,
Don't know.
don't know. So potentially not Russia, potentially. It's also not out of the question. I mean, certainly we can assume Israel probably has. I mean, I guess the question for you, in whose interests was it, the JCPOA?
Israel. Sorry.
Um,
Was the major.
they certainly have the capability. Guangzhou, to me, is an interesting one because Vienna, you could see kind of anyone. Vienna is like the capital of spycraft. Could be,
has been
could
forever.
and has been forever. Could be anyone in Vienna. Havana, Russia has a deep and long relationship with, obviously. Hanoi, kind of anyone's game. It is very difficult to imagine anyone deploying something in Guangzhou without at least tacit approval from the Chinese state, unless it's China themselves. That's a mystery. We didn't get a huge amount of information what was going on in Guangzhou during that. Obviously, we didn't. I mean, they weren't going to tell us anything of that. But definitely, we're talking about multiple states, multiple different deployments of devices for multiple different reasons. There isn't a single campaign by a single actor. I don't know if that answers. I got kind of sidetracked.
I mean, just like a follow-up to that, you know, in my mind, I'm sort of thinking of the word, and it's quite hackneyed at this point, but of psyops. Like, to what extent is this even, is this a psyop? Is it, you know, some form of a psyop? Like, are we thinking of the right sort of stage? Like,
Can you tell people what a psyop is?
a psyop is a psychological operation. It's sort of like a chimera, if you will. But in some sense, it's also effective because it does distort to some extent the sort of cognitive environment. And I feel like a lot of what we're talking about here is, of course, this is like an individual level harm, but this is also harmful in the sense that we don't know what's going on at these spaces. And so it almost feels like we should sort of butt out, you know, and let the experts do their work. So I'm wondering to what extent is that even, you know, is this even a part of that sort of operation?
Well, wouldn't QAnon be the classic
The classic
psyop?
Oh God. Well, QAnon was a different thing because QAnon wasn't a state actor, whereas Havana Syndrome works very well, sort of by definition, as alongside kind of psyops, because the deployment is undetectable, as far as we know, undetectable. And the symptoms are so nebulous and could have other causes, including psychological. In some ways, you only have to deploy it once for people to start getting paranoid and then starting thinking there's a sort of... It can work as both an op and a psyop, to a certain extent.
And what's the difference with QAnon?
QAnon was just some dude in his basement. It was pro-Trump and push-Trump, but it was ultimately not being done by any state or agency.
Yeah, but the way it was deployed by there was one guy behind it, but then there was like an army. And I think that word was even used by the QAnon people themselves. They considered themselves like an army, and they deployed it as a psyop.
Yeah. Well, it depends. We're sort of splitting the hair on the definition of op, right? Like, is an operation something that by definition is done by a government and an agency, or is any time you lie to someone on the internet a psyop? And that's not me coming down on either side of that. I think the word itself isn't particularly well defined. But QAnon felt more like they threw the word psyop around because they were accusing everyone of, you know, the Clintons of it being a psyop. You know, everything was a psyop to those people. Whereas in some ways, I mean, is a marketing campaign is arguably a type of psyop, right? Like anything that's trying to persuade, trying to persuade a group of people of something is a psyop, right? But at some point, you've got to keep the definition within sort of spycraft and sort of black ops work. Otherwise, it sort of loses meaning, right?
But isn't there a difference, because with this, we assume we believe you, as opposed to the National Intelligence Agency, that there is some kind of instrument, some physical force being used, directed at someone. So even if there's psychological aspects to this, there is something happening, as opposed to spreading disinformation through the web, being reported, picked up by the media, and amplified. I mean, that's it. So in a way, QAnon, to my sense, is completely psychological operation, psyop. Whereas this, as you said, we don't know if it's purely, except how can it be purely if people's physical symptoms are so severe and continuing? That's not, and there's so many. If we're just a few, you know, like people claiming there were miracles of the Virgin Mary and or whatever. I mean, we've seen this across time, and maybe these miracles also had some kind of well, okay, we won't go there. But yeah. So how do we? I mean, it seems to me that there's a big difference. And it seems to me that you did QAnon and then you went to something that seemed to have more of a, well, I mean, this takes us someplace else. As you said, QAnon is bottom up. This is obviously at the top.
Yeah. And the way we came to the conclusion we didn't bust anyone pointing a radar dish at an embassy, right? We triangulated from medical advice on the symptoms of the cases that could be psychological and the symptoms that couldn't. And then what we found out from documents and sources that we know that the US has developed and deployed. So in some ways, we went into this and what we were looking at was Americans being targeted. In Havana, we suspect by Russia. But the things we had the most evidence of was America's development and deployment of the devices. So the kind of the Russia bit was sort of those two things meeting in the middle, and sources saying, you know, if Lockheed Martin makes one, Moscow's got one too. But that was the bit that we had only circumstantial evidence for.
You didn't go to Lockheed Martin and say, can you show us the instrument?
We didn't need to. We've seen the patents.
Oh, you have seen
Yeah,
it? Okay.
yeah. They come through
So it's
a
not
Freedom of Information Act
top
request.
secret.
It was top secret when it was developed. It seems like they might have accidentally declassified more of the patent application than they should have done. It's amazing how much stuff comes out for Freedom of Information requests by accident. Like, I'm working on a new show at the moment where there's a Freedom of Information Act request. I won't go into the details of what the new show is, but of a suspected terrorist attack in Illinois, where the FBI has not leveled a charge or arrested a suspect yet. And throughout the entire document, the guy's name is redacted, except on one page where they forgot to redact the name. We're looking at this like, someone has really screwed up here, and it's amazing how often that happens. But yeah, so it was a circumstantial bit of figuring out.
So,
we talk about like different locations where people reported the Havana Syndrome or like the symptoms. Do you expect like from like more U.S. diplomats to report it from other countries? For instance, like if I'm from Turkey, so like if Turkey's relation with America gets like worse, and like then maybe there can be like, a device deployed or something in Turkey, do you think like when the relation with America's, like when the relationship with America sours, we'll see like more of like these reports or something?
I think now that it's in the public domain, seeing more reports of it won't necessarily anymore mean more deployment. It's more difficult to see how it's in the interests of a state like Turkey to really piss off the CIA like that, compared with a state like Russia or China who are playing that kind of game in a different way. But it's not out of the question. If Turkey wanted to get a device like this, it wouldn't be impossible, I don't think, given that we know Russia has built one and will basically sell it to anyone or even give it away if they think it's going to annoy the Americans. And this is just sort of the world we find ourselves living in now.
And just one question. Do we know that this is just to target diplomats, as in a psychological operation or just harming them? Or could this be a way of gathering information? Could this be the new level microwave for listening into conversations that is simply too strong?
Certainly previous iterations of the device have been surveillance tech that turned out to have damaging side effects. From the patents we've seen, it looks like someone's gone, oh, this is the side effect it caused, why don't we take that part of it and build something that just does that directly? But I think we can certainly, as a story, there's so much extrapolation, and given that, then probably this. Yeah, certainly if they had radiation-based surveillance devices in the 70s, they can only have got better now. So probably both is the answer to that.
I want to ask a little bit in regards to the US's capabilities to deploy these kinds of devices. Obviously your investigation was very US intelligence and US capability centric. But I was wondering if there was any documented or even alleged cases that you know of non-US diplomats getting Havana Syndrome, especially diplomats of states that aren't necessarily traditionally US aligned, potentially signifying the likelihood that the US might be using these devices.
We haven't seen, other than a surprisingly high number of Canadians, we haven't got documented evidence of cases from opponent states to the US. But as I say, I think that's because it wouldn't be in Russia's interest to, or China's interests, or to say, oh, we've proved to be vulnerable to this kind of thing. It's just sort of wouldn't be how they'd play it. But no, we haven't seen evidence of that.
But surely, if that was going on, the United States would be in a position to know whether their interference had been effective. The degree of intelligence, what goes on in foreign embassies is surely enough for them to have some sense of whether they're being successful.
Oh, I'm sure they're not gonna tell us. No, they want, and what we heard, and sometimes you hear things from a source where it's sort of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, rather than we're saying this on the record. But we heard from several senior people that their suspicion was that suddenly America was putting the dampeners on everyone talking about it, because America's is better and we don't want to talk about it as, they don't want it in the public eye in case this kind of stuff does come up.
But beyond the four places where you highlighted it, Havana, Hanoi, Vienna, there have been instances in...
Oh, there's that, yeah. Reported instances everywhere. But these run the gamut from senior State Department employees to some dude in Iowa who thinks the government is beaming. And a lot of people, it turns out, think the government is using microwaves to beam messages into their brains.
Question is, what kinds of messages?
And actually, even more than that, a lot of people think their neighbors are using microwaves to beam messages into their brains. There's a lot of accusations of, what's the word? Just being messed with rather than it being some kind of statecraft. We didn't give that a huge amount of credit because that way madness lies. But
Yeah.
Oh, then we get into the whole alien abduction.
oh God, they asked me if I wanted to do Alien for my lecture, and I was like, no. Well, you've been waiting in prayer.
So the big push was the psychosis theory, right? So were there any attempts in reverse psychosis? Because I know with COVID, and I've heard about this with phantom pregnancies happen pretty frequently. And at the end of the 2 weeks, whether it's legitimate or not, the COVID goes away, and then where you get tests and the kind of phantom pregnancy ends. So were there any attempts at reversing it and kind of just working it through that? Because if that would have succeeded, then
that tended to be done by longer term studies. Generally speaking, if you keep track of somebody's a cohort symptoms over 5-10 years, the ones where it's gone away after 2 years can be guessed as psychogenic. The ones where it hasn't, not. That tends to be the diagnostic criteria. If someone's still 8 years down the line, unable to move, unable to speak, psychogenic illnesses tend to ebb and flow with the information pressure that the psychogenesis is coming from. And when the suggestion stops, it tends to slide. Not always, but that tends to be how to distinguish between the two.
Oh, me? Yes.
Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent, sort of replaying a lot of the conversation during COVID. Initially everyone was sort of not everyone, but a good portion of people were paranoid about 5G deployments, and sort of the conversation there where the technology obviously uses, microwave as a concept to transmit, faster data. But to the extent they're sort of seeing some sort of weird correlation between people's sort of, fantastical sort of imaginations of this sort of big plot to sort of, beam, unwilling bits of information into our brains, and also what's been going on in the intelligence community, and also wondering whether or not there's a sort of, maybe there's an unknown alpha sort of between those. Are we seeing a connection or sort of a convergence where conversations in the intelligence community and also what's been going on, say for instance on QAnon, forums, where perhaps there are folks who sit within the government who are also engaging in conspiratorial sort of thinking on these platforms, where everyone is sort of coming together and sort of trying to figure out what exactly is going on. I'm wondering to what extent we're sort of seeing this new sort of change in at least intelligence, technology, and the contrivance of a lot of this. There's this one book by Calden Walton on sort of the evolution of intelligence technology since leading up to the Cold War, and I'm wondering if we're in this new era where we are openly engaging as civilians and also as state agents about what could be going on, and we both are nonetheless informed about these things. Is this a blank assessment? Like, what are we seeing here with this?
I think there's a couple things going on at the same time. One is that government employees in general are not immune from conspiracy theories. They're not immune from being influenced by things they read, going off, going down rabbit holes, that sort of thing. Two is that for a lot of these agencies, it is in their interests in general to have muddy waters, especially the CIA, which just as a matter of institutional tradition likes to operate without people knowing what they're doing. And also that effect is happening with all of these other states as well. So we sometimes think of Russia as being like this kind of unipolar bogeyman, but it's also the same, there can be an argument going on at the top as to whether this is real. Some parts of Russia may be doing something on purpose. The right hand may not know what the left hand is doing for almost any state. And there's certainly a lot of people who, within the US establishment, who, legit people who reported these symptoms, who have fallen for a suggestive, and there's a lot of stigma around having a psychosomatic illness. It's implied that it can be a sign of some kind of weakness, right? Whereas actually anyone is susceptible to it. It's a very powerful phenomenon that anyone can be affected by. Whether you're, a farmer in Iowa who thinks his neighbor is, sending messages to his cat, or the Deputy Secretary of State. Like, everyone's just as vulnerable to that. I don't know if that answers the...
So what about sort of, now I'm going to try to link QAnon a bit to the Havana Syndrome in terms of the way in which it was picked up in the media, whether social media made a thing of it, and whether this is where the psychological aspects of it could have spread more widely. Maybe there are a few cases, but people start reading about it. Can we connect these, or do you see these as completely separate phenomena?
I think the connective tissue is that we're living in an era where there is an unprecedented change in the information ecosystem in which we're all operating. Information now flows across a vast flat network rather than being controlled in any meaningful way by gatekeepers. And that means that both an idea like Havana Syndrome can spread and can lead to people developing psychogenic symptoms, and an idea like QAnon can spread, or any conspiracy theory can spread. The word conspiracy theory itself implies a conspirator, right? Someone who's come up with it. To a certain extent, both of them have at their core someone is clearly intending to do something in both instances. The wide tail of both of these are independent of any single actor. They're happening organically and uncontrollably. And that's, I think, what connects the two, is the fact that we're now in, and we have no countermeasures for this kind of information spread. There's nothing that can be done about the fact that an idea, and ideas have huge power both to cause physical symptoms in terms of psychogenic illness, and to cause violence and political action, obviously. And there is no, and I wouldn't go so far as to call for some kind of control of information, both because hugely problematic in terms of who is controlling information, even if there wasn't the First Amendment, which makes that legally next to impossible anyway. And two, who's doing the controlling, right? If you're in control of the information flow, that's an enormous amount of power. And three, I don't think it's possible anyway. I think the cat is out of the bag, and there's billions of cats, and they're all over the place.
On that point, yesterday, a conversation with a colleague about this question of speech governance, which in and of itself sounds a bit, fraught, if not deeply troubling, especially from the First Amendment perspective. But at least in the fact that we, right now currently do govern speech in some way, whether it be through, for instance, not allowing certain content to be broadcast over the radio waves or on TV, especially on social media or on the internet more generally. We have a much more open avenue to consume any kind of content we would desire, so long as it's not, globally banned or prohibited. But in that sense, there's also, conversations between, for instance, social media companies about the kinds of harms that can be generated from the spread, an unmitigated spread of misinformation. So before Elon Musk, took over Twitter, God bless it, there was, an active, sort of engagement and dialogue with government and other actors within the sort of tech ecosystem to manage, bouts of misinformation. There was a conversation I had with the former head of public policy at Twitter, Yoel Roth, who, for those who don't know, was excoriated and doxxed online, and it was really awful what happened. But there's a lot of work that Twitter was doing to actually even put the brakes on misinformation when it would happen. Sort of developing algorithms that would catch that instance and then either raise that to human moderators or to have, say, a more sort of automated way of thinking about these things. But I guess this goes back to the other question of, but then that would invite the state to have a deeper conversation with these agencies, with these companies, about what kinds of information is legitimate versus not legitimate. And then that, on the other side, would require the national intelligence community to be a bit more, engaging and generative in these conversations. So then we go back into this big sort of cycle, this never-ending cycle of, if they don't want the state to know anything, then the state won't know anything, and so the state might actually end up needing to become more involved. Yeah.
And that just presumes that these actors are all benevolent.
Right.
And you're speaking about it as if this was a benevolent effort,
Right.
and maybe I agree with you, but is there any moment in history where the censors were the good guys? Can you think of any?
Inquisition.
I would say Germany's ban on Nazi content works very well. But the problem with dis and misinformation is, you can't litigate people simply being wrong online. Like if you say something, what you're doing as a moderating agency, and the huge challenge for it's quite easy. As a technical challenge, it's quite easy to prevent the spread of, say, child sex abuse imagery, ISIS propaganda, violent imagery. That's something that human moderators can easily do, and it's very easy to see that an AI, if not now, can soon be trained to do that. Somebody saying something that simply just isn't true requires the moderator or the AI that's doing the moderation to know what is true. That's where things start to become really difficult, because nobody does. How do you, without perfect information, how do you regulate your information to be perfect? That's the challenge.
I want you to tell us a little more about social media, and it seems to me that takes us back to QAnon much more than it does to the Havana Syndrome. So what about the way in which QAnon took fire and got so big, and the role of the social media in that? And I guess this would be a question of, is it just algorithms? Is it emotion, or is this about activist networks, people finding one another?
It's sort of all of the above. Algorithms, people talk about it's funny, people talk about the algorithm now like it's, the language they use is sort of like we're talking about some kind of trickster god, like the algorithm decides. The algorithm is just data processing. It's taking it's taking how much time you spend on one thing and then giving you more of that. So the algorithm acts as a sort of force multiplier for human information. And humans like information that come with a good story. Stories remain the most powerful driver of information, narrative. And QAnon was a very powerful narrative, and a narrative that goes back far beyond, way before QAnon, that there is a shadowy cabal running things to your detriment. It's one of the oldest, calling it a conspiracy theory is almost, it's simply one of the key stories. It's a Dreyfus affair, you can draw a direct line back to it. And that's, the algorithm is going to focus that, but it's not the algorithm itself that's doing it, nor is it the social media ecosystem itself that's doing it, but both of those things are just, magnifying the potential effects and speeding up the potential effects. So you've got this kind of thing that's always existed, but an exponential growth of how powerful it can be. That's where I think we are. And that's only getting more. Something like TikTok, visual media, is that much more powerful again than something like Twitter and Facebook, which are largely, printed word fundamentally. Short form video, we have no idea what the effect of that looks like versus Twitter and Facebook. And because it's so much more algorithmically driven and so much less easy to search. You can't backfigure where a particular narrative has come from on TikTok the way you can on Twitter. You can't trace it to its source. And that could be a disaster, or it could be more of the same, which is sort of already a disaster. And it doesn't help that algorithm in particular is being controlled quite solidly by the Chinese government. A friend of mine was at a classified MI5 briefing about TikTok and came away panicking. And it's not just what the algorithm can do on the narrative. With TikTok, the access it gives to your phone makes the NSA's PRISM program look like nothing. I mean, it's actually quite similar to PRISM. It's got a multi-hop. It can take shots of your screen at any time, even if the app isn't running. It's truly horrifying that TikTok gives people to your phone. But also, the provenance of the information on it could be tweaked, and there'd be no way of tracing it. No one's come up with a way of mapping the spread of information on TikTok.
So I think the moral of that story is don't go on TikTok. If
Well,
you have a TikTok account.
It's too late. If you have a friend in your contacts book who has TikTok, that's almost as much access as you having it yourself. I was asking another friend who's a former CIA analyst. This is a bit of a tangent, but I felt patriotism for the first time of this, and I was asking what what kind of global agencies should we be most worried about in terms of being in your phone. He was like, Russia's kind of a paper tiger to some extent, like their signals intelligence isn't amazing. China, TikTok gives them a huge angle in, but they're not capable of direct kind of brute force cracking a phone. America, if they want to be in your phone, if they really, really want to, they can get in. Then he was like, Britain is already in your phone. Apparently, I heard this from other kind of US intelligence sources. Everyone wishes they were GCHQ, because GCHQ is the NSA with none of the the government oversight. The NSA needs a FISA court order to crack into somebody's phone. There's no such thing for the UK. They've got all of the same technical capabilities with none of the legal restrictions. And I was like, yeah, UK. But yeah, so the last thing Britain's best in the world at is phone hacking. But I guess by the press and by the by the government.
Perhaps they have one of these machines as well.
Oh, I mean, Britain does, yeah. We know that they're one of
the...
the...
It might be the British making mischief?
Maybe. I mean, we know we bought the Lockheed Martin one. We don't know what we're using it for. Britain doesn't have that many people that would be immediately obvious as people we'd... I mean, maybe France, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe they're the ones targeting the Canadians.
Oh, but why would anyone target the Canadians?
Who else would target the Canadians? The Americans don't know that Canada exists, right?
It is, and it was in Cuba that the Canadians got hit, and they got hit hard. I mean, there was 2,000 Canadians affected by it, and they weren't incidental; they were directly targeted. I mean, I guess to whichever agency is just assumed that Canada and the other Five Eyes are essentially part of the same operation, I guess. Or they want to scare the Canadians.
Fascinating. I think we've just about run out of time. So also because I think people will want a preview of your next
yeah, but this needs to be entirely also.
We're going to give you a hand. Thank you so much for